I just want to welcome everyone and tell you how excited we are to have you all here at this kickoff event for the Flagstaff College Flagstaff 3.5% project. I'm Sandra Lubarski, and I'm the president of Flagstaff College and one of the co-founders. Marcus Ford is here as well, and he's the other co-founder of the college. We are just delighted to have you here, even though I'm going to start with this framing, this depressing framing of the event, which was yesterday's news from the UN, that greenhouse gases in the atmosphere hit record levels in 2020, even though we were all in lockdown all over the world, and nonetheless, greenhouse gases rose. So I think that's probably all I need to say to explain why we're doing the Flagstaff 3.5% project. Of course, I'll say a little bit more, but, and that is, I love the movie. I don't know if how many of you have seen the movie Jojo Rabbit that came out a few years ago. It was a Holocaust movie, but kind of an upbeat Holocaust movie, if that's a possibility. And there is this really moving scene that I can hardly recall without bringing me to tears. And I'm not giving anything away when I say there's a scene when the little boy is with his mother in the square in their little town, their little village in Germany. And he sees people who have been hung by the Nazis. And he says to his mother, "What did they do?" And she says, "They did what they could." And I think that that's what brings us here tonight, is that we are all wanting to do what we can, that the climate crisis is too big and too overwhelming and too depressing for us to sit at home and read a book by ourselves and wonder what each of us alone can do. We have to figure this out together. And so these reading action groups, not just a reading group, but a reading group that takes us into action together, is what we hope will yield ideas for what we can do. Not everyone who's joining us tonight is in Flagstaff, but we're hoping that the project that we're founding in Flagstaff can be generalizable to other communities, and that, that some of the ideas that we will consider here will be transferable elsewhere, and that you'll start a 3.5% project in your own communities. And we hope that in our town of Flagstaff that we will be able to strengthen the community and the work that has already been started in this community. In Flagstaff, the City Council approved a carbon neutrality plan for 2030. But how we engage in that plan, how we contribute to that plan, is something I think we all want to know. And hopefully by the end of this 5 weeks, we will have a clearer sense of what that means. I'm going to stop there, and I want to introduce Mark Ford, who's going to talk a little bit, a tiny bit, about Flagstaff College.
Hi, and welcome, and thank you all for joining us. You know, there's about 2,000 or 3,000 colleges and universities in the United States, depending on how you count. And many of them are under-enrolled and underfunded. So a perfectly rational question is, why is this a good time to start a new college? And the short answer is because we're doing something different. Flagstaff College is small, it's affordable, and it only has one major: sustainability and social change. And most colleges have hundreds of different majors because there's many interesting things to study and many different ways to study these things. We only have one major because we believe that if we can't sustain human civilization, then nothing else really matters. And we also believe that we cannot sustain human civilization without very substantial social change. Therefore, we have only one major, which is sustainability and social change. And we're very fortunate tonight to have two experts on social change. I want to admit to a little irony in the situation that as a college, we're also committed to face-to-face, in-person, local education. So there's a little irony in the fact that we're starting out with 150 people on a Zoom call, and our speakers are on the East Coast and on the West Coast. But we also believe that there's a time and place for everything. And this is the time and the place to have this kind of Zoom meeting. So you can find out more about the college if you go to our website, flagstaffcollege.education. And let me turn it back to Sandra, and she'll introduce the speakers.
Thanks, Mark. But before I do that, I want to introduce Kayla Winters. And Kayla, as you will see, is much younger than Mark and I. And, and that's good, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to organize this Zoom gathering. And so Kayla is our social media and our technology wizard. And she's going to say a few words about housekeeping.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. It is so exciting to be here with 90 people. Crazy. Just a couple weeks ago, we were brainstorming all this, and it's so exciting to be here now. But I do want to go over a couple of housekeeping items. We do ask that you all remain on mute. It just helps for a seamless experience. And then we want to open you guys up for questions as they go through their presentations today. And we just ask that you guys put a Q before you write out your question in the chat. And so they will be pulling those questions from the chat after the presentations. So just being mindful of that. If you have any questions, throwing them in the chat. And then at the very end today, we will be going into our breakout rooms for those of you who opted in for that. So just making sure that you have your calendar, pen and paper handy to be able to jump in that with your group at the very end. But thank you guys, and I'll throw it back over to Sandra.
Unfortunately, tonight we don't have anyone from the Sunrise Tempe movement, but we do have two amazing speakers, and they're each going to speak for 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have some time for Q&A, and then again go into this breakout groups. And in your breakout groups, you have an assignment, and that is to introduce yourselves to each other, to figure out when the first time, your first meeting time is, to choose an actual time. We just gave, periods like morning, evening, afternoon. So choose a time, a place, and a date to start, okay? Some people, like our speakers tonight, have done so much good and important work that it's impossible to do more than give you a hint of how lucky we are to have them with us. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Professor Erica Chenoweth, who was named one of the top 100 global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine for their research and promotion of nonviolent resistance. Professor Chenoweth won the 2014 Carl Deutsch Award as the scholar under 40 who has made the most significant impact on the field of international politics or peace research. Together with Maria J. Stefan, they won the 2013 Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. Their book, Why Civil Resistance Works, won the American Political Science Association's most prestigious award in the field. In addition to a bounty of books and articles and an award-winning blog, Dr. Chenoweth directs the Nonviolent Action Lab at Harvard, studying political violence and, importantly, its alternatives. I urge you to watch their fabulous TEDx Boulder talk, which is online, and to read their most recent book, Civil Resistance, What Everyone Needs to Know. Welcome, Erica.
Thank you so much, Sandra and Mark and Kayla, for the introduction and for coordinating this event. Hi to everybody out there, those who are now new friends and those whom I have perhaps interacted with before. If that is you, hello again. And also to all the folks in the classroom doing this in a hybrid format. I'm I'm really delighted to hear what Ignacio has to say. I consider myself much more a student of these topics than an expert of them. But I will say that I'm very excited to be here with you tonight talking about nonviolent resistance as a force for change related to climate change. And the way that you see it interacting with your experience of reading Kim Stanley Robinson's book, actually. I was telling Sandra beforehand that I interacted with him in 2014 at a science conference where he described himself as a utopian sci-fi writer and told me that if we can imagine it, we can do it. And that was the main ethos behind everything that he wrote. Was trying to help people imagine the world that we could create. And, you know, I think that it's really important to keep in mind what capacities we have, what experiences we have developed as a human family, and what we might be able to do together with them to find a just solution to the climate crisis. So what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about some good news. And then talk a little bit about the origins of what people call the 3.5% rule and some important caveats or qualifications to it, and then conclude with an observation or two about where we are right now in the world. So to start with some good news, I first want to say that we live in really rich times when it comes to the experience needed to mobilize effective collective action around our problems. First of all, we live in a time where more people have accepted the reality that we're on course for total disaster. The planet won't be inhabitable by us in the reasonably near future. That's becoming a consensus around the world. We have people who are aware of this, who feel activated to do something about it. And this is also information that that kind of collides with the availability of new technologies, a whole bunch of roadmaps, legislative proposals, and lots of bold ideas that exist out there in the world for the place that we might create together. At the same time, we also live in a time where more people have used people power techniques where people basically use combinations of protest, strikes, other forms of non-cooperation in a coordinated way in order to confront their problems than in any other time in recorded human history. So I'll just say that in the data set that I maintain, which looks at large scale mobilizations worldwide from 1900 onward, the most recent numbers are that there have been more mass mobilizations recorded in the past 20 years than there were during the entire 20th century. What that means basically is that people are using people power. It makes our world feel contentious and tumultuous, but it also provides a wealth of organizational capacity, experience, and most importantly, knowledge and know-how for how to create change when change is hard. In addition to that, over the past couple of years, notwithstanding the COVID pandemic, we've also seen more people in this country, in the United States, turn to mass nonviolent resistance than in any other period in our country's recorded history. So basically, during the anti-racism uprising of 2000, we saw anywhere between 10 and 26 million Americans participate in at least one protest in favor of racial justice broadly defined. There's never been any kind of mass mobilization of that scale in contemporary American history. And it shows that there's a population that is willing to be activated and take some degree of responsibility, even in sort of a broad way in our country. There was also sustained organizing in advance of the 2020 election that I would say is probably unprecedented in contemporary American history, where there was a broad-based coalition to make sure that votes were counted, that the winner of the election was not just certified, but also inaugurated. And that activated a huge grassroots capacity that our country hasn't seen in terms of a broad-based coalition in a really long time. And so the last really good piece of really good news is the fact that if you go online today and do a search for, how to do an effective movement, you'll immediately turn up any number of training guides, manuals, some of them in agreement, some of them kind of discussing different controversial ideas, but basically the upshot is that we have more information, knowledge, and experience at our fingertips today for how to wage nonviolent struggle effectively than anybody has ever had, right? So we just have the tools we need to do this. And what we don't have really is the political will. That's basically the ingredient that's missing. And so then the question becomes, how do people create political will when there isn't one, but there's sort of an overwhelming popular consensus? There's a large number of people who are willing to make some sacrifices in order to see through the change, et cetera. And how do you get people who are sort of in a position to make decisions, to take bold, transformative action? And my hypothesis about this is basically that mass mobilization has been a really important force for such types of transformative changes. There are hundreds of examples over the course of world history where it's had truly meaningful impacts on systemic problems, even global systemic problems. And that if we learn some lessons from what they did, we might find ourselves in a similar position of making change and surprising ourselves with the success. So I'll mention the 4 things that effective movements that I've studied have done. The first is, of course, mobilize mass participation, which usually requires a degree of good organizing in advance. So this isn't just kind of improvised snap mass mobilization, but instead is sort of sustained organizing that then transfers into high commitment mobilization by people. And the second thing that effective movements do is that they create defections among the opponent's pillars of support. So, in many of the cases that I'm looking at, they're trying to, expel foreign military occupations or colonial rule, or they're trying to topple autocratic regimes. And so what they're trying to do is basically dislocate different arms of the government from itself. So they're trying to get the security forces to refuse to obey orders, or economic and business elites to decide it's not in their interest to support the status quo anymore. In the case of the climate movement, it's basically using a sophisticated map of who the stakeholders are in maintaining the status quo, and finding ways to effectively pull them away from that position, right? Either through making it too costly to continue supporting the status quo in terms of profit margins, or by kind of nudging people who already are kind of on the fence about what they ought to do. Either way, it's kind of scoring key defections within the opponent's pillars of support. And this is really important because I think one of the dangers is sort of thinking that a movement has to sort of win over a vast majority of people, and that then, political decision makers or whatever will sort of follow along. And usually the way it happens is that there's kind of a critical mass of people who are won over, but then there are a few key pillars of support that shift their loyalty, and that's, it sort of leads to a cascade that results in change. The third thing that successful movements do is they don't over-rely on specific tactics like protest or demonstrations. I think I mentioned that we're in this era in which more people are turning to people power techniques than ever before, but I also think we're in an era where people kind of conflate people power techniques with protest or mass demonstrations in their minds. And it's understandable why, because they make for striking visual imagery. They're symbolically powerful. They're easy for people to find and to participate in. But they're not necessarily the most kind of disruptive or costly from the opponent's point of view. There's sort of a sense of people can blow off steam in the streets, and then if they're ignored, they won't do anything else. And so, there's a sense of movements that over-rely on protests and street demos tend to succeed less than movements that find new tactics like strikes, boycotts, not other forms of non-cooperation that begin to impose real and direct costs, immediate costs, especially on economic and business interests. And then the fourth thing that successful movements do is they tend to maintain resilience even as repression begins to escalate against them, because movements that actually do begin to threaten the status quo and threaten powerful interests do tend to elicit violence against them. And that's not to say that it's justified, but it's often expected by movements that genuinely challenge the status quo. And so when movements do that, if they respond to repression or violence by kind of falling apart or falling into disarray or being diverted from their own strategic plan, then this can be difficult for the movement to recover from. So basically there's these four things: mass mobilization, defections, tactical innovation, and resilience. And the 3.5% rule, which Sandra mentioned in her intro, is associated with a research study that I did underlying the analysis for Maria Steffens in my book back in 2011. The 3.5% rule emerges from the observation that in the data that we used for that book, there weren't any mass mobilizations that failed after they mobilized 3.5% of the national population of the country they were opposing. And the reason that is, I think, a striking figure is because, first of all, it's much smaller than most people imagine as a proportion of the population. So, it seems easier to do for organizers to say, okay, in the United States, that means we need like 11.5 million people as opposed to 170 million. So it can feel doable, right? I would say, though, that the 3.5% rule I think it's better to think of it as a rule of thumb than as an iron law. And the reason is that the rule emanates from historical data that covered the period 1900 to 2006. And since 2006, as I mentioned, we've seen something like 150 new campaigns, some of which actually were trying to organize to the 3.5% rule, right? So there are some campaigns that, as far as I know, were actually aiming for that number, or at least some of the organizers were. And it's not really known whether the rule applies when people are only trying to organize to that level. What's known is that when we looked at those historical data, there was this pattern and trend. It doesn't necessarily hold that if we prescribe that number, that the same political dynamics obtain. The second thing that's important to note is that since that finding was established, there's been an exception. The exception was the uprising in Bahrain that occurred during the Arab Spring waves. The peak mobilization there was reportedly around 7%. And this is why I say that it's more of a rule of thumb than an iron law, because there are exceptions to every rule, and this is one. And the last thing I would say is that the definition of success that Maria and I used, and that I use when I conduct analyses on this global data set that I mentioned, is a discrete and narrow definition of success. So for example, we define success as the movement effectively toppling the incumbent national regime or achieving territorial independence, because those are the types of movements that we were studying there. What it doesn't account for is, say, counter-revolution, the sustainability of that outcome. So for example, 3 years later, what happened to the country? Is it like Sudan today, where there was a coup yesterday that basically completely reversed the outcomes of the democratic revolution of 2019? And so, I think in the case of the climate movement, it requires more than just a discrete breakthrough, right? What we're looking for is change in people's habits, behaviors, and expectations about what's appropriate. And so while it's important to think about mass mobilization as a way to affect the political will and the decision-making for leaders who are in a position to sort of implement the types of bold transformative change we need, there's also the need to create support and behavioral and habitual change of people. And so there's another threshold that sociologists talk about that's like a critical mass threshold for basically creating a small core of committed people who, through their social networks, basically tip social behaviors into new behaviors. And that threshold is 25%. So again, not majorities, not 100%, but a little more than 3.5%. And so I would just encourage people to think about the different elements of the climate movement that might be different from the scope of the cases that Maria and I analyzed. And this isn't to say that the rule is useless. I think it still has a lot of potential utility in thinking through when the sort of rubber meets the road, like if there is a moment in which people feel it necessary to engage and sustain civil resistance and civil disobedience, the type of numbers that might be required to create essentially a political opening, right? That then allows for defections. I think it can be useful in that sense. And so I wouldn't kind of jettison the idea altogether, but I think it's important for people to know the limits and caveats. So my final observation before we get to hear from Ignacio is simply that one of the great paradoxes of this moment, for me anyway, and looking at the data and the sort of patterns out there in the world, is that we have, as I mentioned, more mass mobilizations over the past 20 years than we had in the whole 20th century. We have more information at our fingertips for how to do this, but we also have started to see a slight decline in the effectiveness of nonviolent resistance over the past 10 years in particular. And part of the reason for that is that actually many movements have been mobilizing fewer people than movements that preceded them. So the share of mass mobilization has actually been relatively smaller than before. As I mentioned earlier, there's been an over-reliance on mass demonstrations and protests. This might be a function of our digital environment in which protests and mass demos make for incredible photos, and it's easy to get people to turn out to them, but hard to sort of sustain participation over time and shift to other techniques like non-cooperation. There's a much more contested discourse around the use of nonviolent resistance right now. And there's also, I think, a growing savvy on the part of the opponents of these campaigns for how to disrupt them and undermine them. And so I think that those are formidable challenges to the use of people power movements. It's important for people to know that there has been a decline in success and to know where that's coming from and why it's happening, and to try not to repeat the mistakes that some movements have made, and to sort of prepare for what the movement might be up against if it actually really starts to threaten the status quo in a major way. But that said, like I mentioned, the only way the world has ever changed is through these movements and the transformative power of popular participation. And so I commend all of you for trying to be part of that. I really look forward to the discussion that we get to have soon, and also to hearing what Ignacio has to say. So I think I'll turn it back to you for now, Sandra, to introduce him.
Thank you so much. I wish it weren't so complex, but I appreciate your research that helps us understand the challenges in front of us. It's incredibly helpful. Thank you for that beautifully clear presentation. Now I have the pleasure of introducing Ignacio Castura. The Reverend Dr. Ignacio Castura has had a groundbreaking career. He was the first Mexican-American district superintendent of the United Methodist Church in the Los Angeles district, a very big district, and the first national chaplain for Planned Parenthood Federation of America. During the AIDS pandemic, he transformed his church in Hollywood, California, into a center that modeled a supportive religious response. His book, Dreams on Fire, Embers of Hope, a collection of essays written in response to the Rodney King riots, was one of the top religious books of that year. In line with his religious activism, Dr. Castura served as the Jameson Jones Professor in the Prophetic Tradition, and that is certainly the tradition he operates in. That was at Iliff School of Theology. He's currently the director of the Latin American project of the Center for Process Studies at the Claremont School of Theology. Welcome, Ignacio.
Thank you very, very, very much. And also thank you to Professor Chenoweth for that wonderful presentation. It's great to have all the data that you're sharing to pass on to people that we try to recruit to get into the movement, because it gives them a very specific sense that of how achievable some things can be. And I want to explain a little bit, given the fact that religion has become such a terrible term in the last few years, why I became a pastor. I was looking around at what was happening particularly in the United States, and the movements that were making any significant difference were being either led or had the heavy participation of religious people. So for me, that was a no-brainer in a sense. I had to go and follow them, follow the Martin Luther Kings and all of the other associates of King, Jewish and Christian, that surrounded him with their support and in many instances their protection. So I am not sure that today I would have really good examples of people like those that inspire me to go into religion. I still believe that it is an important force, but it takes so much explanation to get people going and see why it does make sense to support a religious movement. And thanks to the research that we have, the movement of Gandhi, for instance, was a nonviolent movement, and it's easy to point them to say Gandhi was a religious person. And by the way, in the northern part, there was the Islamic leader, the nonviolent soldier of Islam, Badshah Khan. And it's always great to have these religious examples of people who did not understand religion as being cloistered, but actually hitting the pavement, hitting the dust of the roads and taking on the difficult issues of their time. It was very early that I understood that the most important movement to join and to support was the protection of the earth. And that's because I was a student of Professor John Cobb at the School of Theology at Claremont, who in 1970, the very same year of the first Earth day, produced a book called Is It Too Late?, in which he was really advocating for us to understand the threat to the environment and to organize in doing something. A couple of years later, the Club de Roma had assigned a study, had commissioned a study about the more specific threats to the environment. And that came out as Limits to Growth, a book in 1972 that basically predicted a catastrophe. In response to that, John Cobb organized an event in which I also participated both in the preparation, the organization, and also as one of the speakers at that time. And it was called the Alternatives to Catastrophe Conference. And we were looking at different ways of responding to what was obvious to us, a threat to the environment. So from the very beginning, the moral dimension of the response to the impending ecological catastrophe had religious, moral, ethical grounding. And so all the time I have been acting on the basis of that. That didn't mean that I did not pay attention to all of the other movements. And as Sandra already explained, I have been involved in several of them. The most recent one that I'm involved, one that that will impact me more, given that I just turned 80 last weekend, is the movement of death with dignity. You know, I mean, wealthy people can take a short vacation to Switzerland, let's say, and you know, a relative can bring the ashes back. The poor people don't have that option, and it seems to me that that's something that all of us in America need to advocate for also, because not everyone has that availability. That's the one that will impact me the most, I think. But above all of those, but never disconnecting from any of those movements, is the movement to protect the earth. And it became clearer and clearer. And before the end of the 20th century, John Cobb wrote a book called The Earthist Challenge to Economism. And essentially what he was arguing in that book, after spending time in the World Bank, he came to the realization that the real religion in the world, not just in America, was economism. And that we were living in the time of economism, and that no one really was mounting any kind of a movement to provide an alternative to that. And so he proposed the term Earthism, so the Earthist Challenge to Economism. And since he has been primarily writing to people who are grounded in theology and belong to different religions, he understood that people could misunderstand his call to Earthism as the imposition of an idol, something less important than God, that would take the complete allegiance and support of those that would follow that. And he said, it's not a heretical movement. It is rather the way in which we can serve God as understood by any of the religions is by making sure that we all protect the earth that God gave to us. So around that time, he also suggested that Earthism should be the religion that binds us. You know, it's interesting that religions tend to divide people, but he was suggesting that Earthism should become the religion that binds us. So it's wonderful also now to have, in addition to the moral, ethical, theological support for involvement in the defense of the earth, to have more and more corroboration that the scientists have been correct in what they have been saying about the threat to the environment. And for instance, the three Nobel Prize winners in physics this year, they all worked on issues related to global warming. And so it's now undeniable. I mean, of course, people will deny it, but it is really, if you start thinking seriously about it, you have to come to the conclusion that scientists have now rallied around and have proven that the threat to the environment is a human threat to the environment, and that the response to that human threat to the environment needs to be a moral response, an ethical response, a religious response. I will not push necessarily that it has to be a religious response, but it has to be ethical, has to be moral. And I believe that that's the base out of which, the most important base out of which we can respond creatively to the immense threat that is presented to us now in with the global warming. It's interesting that in 1969, 1 year before the year of the first Earth Day, we had an oil spill here in the Santa Barbara Channel. And just a couple of weeks ago, we had an oil spill again, 50 plus years later, and now making people realize, why did we not respond more creatively back then? Why do we have to wait now 50 years later to start doing something? So it seems to me that the confluence of more and more supported scientific data that indicates to us that the challenges to the earth emanate or flow out of the human activity, that we need to have human activity that curtails the negative human activity, and that positive human activity needs to be grounded and based on deep theological, or deep, at least ethical and moral foundations. I think I'll leave it at that, and hopefully I have generated, or the two of us will generate enough questions that we can then get it into more specifics.
Oh, thank you so much, Ignacio. And I am appreciative that we have plenty of time here for some questions. We've got a question from Joan, who I know, who identifies as an 81-year-old retired psychiatrist. And Joan is asking about energy and about the capacity to really engage in this kind of overwhelming work at her point in life. And I'm wondering if either of you have advice in that regard. Ignacio, since it was your birthday, do you want to start?
Yeah. You start, and then I'll follow up.
Well, I'm afraid I didn't quite catch completely the import of the question. So Sandra, will you please give it again?
Sure. She says, as an 81-year-old retired psychiatrist, I feel less hopeful that humans have the ability in an overwhelmed world to really take on the worst of all possible issues. Is it the pessimism of the age that I speak from? Will the young who have much more energy really mobilize to take this on? And I think basically asking that really fundamental personal existential question, where do we find the capacity to do this work?
Well, the most immediate answer that comes to me, that I get a lot of the energy and the hope from the work that Erica has done, for instance, but I also get it from movements of younger people that I see. For instance, I was able to take John Cobb, who is 96, on the verge of becoming 97 in a few months. And I was able to take him to the first meeting of Sunrise here in Los Angeles. And we both were so elated to see so many young people putting their shoulder to the wheel and doing the work that needs to be done. I think Greta Thunberg is another source of incredible hope for me. I mean, I don't count on 80-year-old retired priest or pastors or 81 retired psychiatrists to find necessarily all of the answers there. I think the answers are floating all over the place, and I think some people are reaching for those. But I guess I'm inevitably a person of hope, not of optimism, but a person of hope. And Cobb always distinguishes between hope and optimism. Optimism, it's merely just optimism sort of flows out of extrapolating out of the good things that you see, and pessimism is extrapolating out of the bad things that you see. But hope always believes that there is something else that is not in the mix right now, you know, and time again, we have had historical evidence that has happened over and over again, and in situations that have appeared to be completely hopeless, out of what appears to be nowhere, something happens. So both, and in what I see already, what I hear, what I read, and also in that sense of hope that something else can also come in from other unexpected place. That's where I get it.
I actually find the work of Erica, the work that you've done is hopeful. It's very, very helpful in that regard. But go ahead, Erica, your comments.
Well, I think that one of the beauties of nonviolent resistance is that there's always a role for everyone. It's the most inclusive kind of mass mobilization that exists. And I remember a story a friend told me who's part of the Serbian Revolution in 2000. And he said that he was a student at the time, and when they would protest as students, the police would beat them horribly. And so they started to do this thing where they organized what they called grandparents protests, where they bring their retired grandparents with them on either side of them, and the police wouldn't beat them. There was just a taboo about it, and that might not work everywhere, but in their context, it did work. There's also in the climate movement, there are so many different levers, right? So there's sort of economic and business interests. There are political interests. There's just, the day-to-day sense that what we do is the status quo, and the status quo isn't going to change. And there are lots of things that people from all walks of life can do to either habituate people to new behaviors, to model new behaviors, to help make phone calls, to elected officials, to help support education campaigns, public education campaigns. And if people are more introverted and they don't want to engage in that type of work, they can do lots of things around helping to organize different types of economic pressure, and support efforts to try to imagine the main alternatives, because fundamentally, the problem is one of paradigm shift. We're talking about a global paradigm shift. And we know that paradigm shifts happen not just when we know that the old way isn't working, but also when we can imagine and see a new way that will work. And that's when people shift over. And so anybody can be part of this solution. I would just say to find the people that you connect to, that you feel like you can support or be part of what they're up to, and never be discouraged by thinking that your contribution is too small.
Thank you. I'm going to move to the question that Krista's asked, and that is about, the overwhelming need for new economic systems, and how we move the paradigm in terms of the economic system. And if for those of you who have read the book or in the process of reading the book, changing the economic system is a big part of this, of achieving really being able to address the climate crisis. There's also a technological piece, and there is also a very undeveloped but very important religious piece. And it is unfortunate, I think, that Kim Stanley Robinson was not able to develop a discussion, a real full-blown notion of Earthism, but he does go into that economic piece. And I'm wondering, Erica, if you could then speak a little bit more about how we take on an economic system. How's that for a softball?
Well, I'm sure there are people here who have better ideas than I do, and who are more trained in these matters than I am and better read. But what I would say is that one of the key tools for mass movements is to do what some people refer to as a power map, or a sort of spectrum of allies exercise. And the main goal of that is basically to figure out, you know, if you have like a particular corporation that's just, you know, their profit margins are such that they're not going to shift their extraction and production. They're just never going to do it alone. Then, you know, part of the question is, well, how do you, there's sort of like, if you want to do kind of the incremental model, then the main goal is to figure out who their shareholders are, who their employees are, their managers, the different pillars of support for that particular company or the group of companies or whatever, and begin to innovate tactics that affect their willingness to maintain the status quo using nonviolent resistance. And I think, you know, you might be asking a separate question, which is like, how do we end capitalism? And if that's the question you're asking, then I don't have any good answers. But I will say that that I think that there are lots of things that are happening right now in the world that demonstrate discontent with the sort of runaway capitalist system. And there's a lot of really interesting innovation happening in the field of economics and in the field of political economy. And there are people who are thinking about these things and trying to come up with alternative models, and activists as well. And so, you know, I'll think through and then drop in the chat a couple of citations of people that I know about or projects that I know about that speak to these issues. But, you know, it's similar to this question about how do you get the two Democratic senators to get on board with, you know, the climate climate proposals and the legislation. And, you know, I think, again, it's about power mapping. It's like, who are their senior staffers? Like, who do they listen to? Are they listening to their senior staff? Are they listening to lobbyists? Are they listening to their constituents? Who in their constituents? Like, who's actually like influencing their mindset about this stuff, and how can they be moved? And you know, if they can't be moved, then, you know, which Republicans aren't going up for re-election or are going to lose their re-election, who might be able to caucus with Democrats on this one? You know, they're just really thinking creatively about those pillars of support and ways to sort of force a political crisis such that they sort of have to reevaluate whether it's in their own political interests or long-term interests to maintain the status quo. And, you know, it's sounds easy. It's not.
Whoops, we've
Easy to make these political changes. Like I said, that's the way those changes come about. Is that
great. And unfortunately, you froze at the end there. Are you back with us? Looks like you are.
yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, I'll shut up though. I mostly made my point. And
We don't want you to
Ignacio
shut up.
might have
It's so helpful. So I know we're coming to an end here. I'd like to hear from both of you, just from your own experience, what it means to engage. Erica, you talk about that 3.5% of people who are engaged in change, and what does it mean to be engaged? At what level do we need to put our energy? And Ignacio, you are someone who did that, has done that for decades. Give us a sense of what you think engagement means in our lives.
Well, let's see. I believe that those people that are most directly affected by the negative sides of an issue are the ones that we need to get to know first. And I'll use it as one of the examples. The farm worker movement in start both primarily in California. That's what I got to know best. I later on learned more about the national thing. But what happened is, as people really got to know those that were hurting the most, those who were impacted negatively the most, and began to hear their stories better, people began responding. People began responding to that. You know, I mean, the movement alone, the Cesar Chavez's movement, would not have succeeded if it had remained strictly a movement of farm workers. It was the farm workers that went to the cities and interacted with people who were sympathetic and caring, and were able to see the humanity of those who were hurting the most. And then they made their cause also something that they were going to be invested in. Without that kind of coming together, it would not have happened. It just would not have happened. And eventually, as you know, it became a national movement because more and more people began to realize that the basic model of getting city people to understand the difficulties, the pain, the hard work of the farm workers, that only then could there be a national movement. And it did work. It did work. In the case of the race issue, let's not forget also that if it had only been strictly a Black movement, I don't think it would have succeeded. But there were so many people, so many white people that were part of that and who were willing to be in the second row, not in the front row. You know, one person that to me was a hero, you know, and you will not find many photographs of him directly, but he was working with Martin Luther King, and he was the one who was recommending other Black people who had studied, for instance, in India, the nonviolent movement. Glenn Smiley was the name of that wonderful man. And then, of course, look at how many of the martyrs of that movement were white. So because as they got in touch with those who were hurting the most, they were able to understand their pain and then enter through that. It seems to me that without that, it remains only just something that floats above you. You have to humanize it. You have to personalize it. The farm workers went to churches, to Rotary clubs, to wherever people open it up for them, they would go. And as soon as people heard the message, it was a lot easier for people to understand that these were real human beings hurting, and not just somebody that was totally different from them.
Great, thanks. Erica, some last guidance from you.
Well, I just put a couple of resources in the chat following up on the last few things I was saying. And, I think I really appreciate the questions and discussion. I think that we're one of the most promising things that happened during the pandemic was the rise of mutual aid associations. And mutual aid associations have a long history in the US and around the world. They've been fundamental in the survival of communities that have existed in this country under government neglect or kind of criminal willful neglect in many cases. But there's also a really powerful thing to learn about the way that a sort of common sense of crisis brought people together in organizing and taught people lessons about how to effectively organize. And that's a lot we can build on to create resilience, capacity, and kind of motivation to stay engaged and to continue participating. In terms of how many people does it actually take, I'm not sure. We're talking about a global systemic issue. And so it's not just the United States, it's complex. It requires participation by people in basically every country in the world. But there's also a really clear, as I mentioned, and growing consensus about the need to take urgent action. And I'm hopeful that the pressure will be on people in Glasgow in the coming weeks to actually take those transformative steps. And there certainly won't be any pressure on them if we don't put pressure on them. So I think that's something to keep in mind.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. I wish we could extend this evening out. I wish we could bring you back repeatedly. But we're so grateful to have both of you here with us tonight. And please join me in thanking Ignacio and Erica, not just for being with us tonight, but for all the good work they've done, and for your guidance and your inspiration, and for being role models for social change. Many thanks to you. We are going to move into breakout groups here. But before we do, I want to give a quick shout out to the organizations that have been working in solidarity with us. That's the Northern Arizona Climate Change Alliance, Friends of Flagstaff's Future, Friends of the Rio, Townsite Community Land Trust, the Star School, and Communicating with Heart. Many thanks. There are many more organizations doing great work in the community, and that's what we want to